Why? Because you disrupt the electrical.
So hitting someone here, it doesn't have that problem, can kill them.
It could, it's rare, but it could. Don't give me ideas. I'm gonna get your test graded this afternoon. All right, are we okay with this? It takes a minute to understand, but the key is recognizing that the electrical stuff is separate and apart from the physical contraction. One leads to the other, but they're not the same thing. Okay? Are we good so far? Now let's talk about some complicated stuff. Let's talk about how skeletal muscles, or how cardiac muscle is different from skeletal. We already said one key difference, and that is that skeletal muscles require what? They have to have a nerve zap to tell them what to do. Why do cardiac muscle cells not require that? They are self-excitable, and what makes them self-excitable? This right here. What do we got going here? This looks like my diagram, but it's different. Everybody see what she's talking about? Look at that diagram. Do you see the resting potential, which is normally around -60 or so? Look at my resting potential. This is what I'm gonna be when I go home today. I'm gonna be flat line wherever I am, right? Straight. But what's going on up there?
Oh. It's a slight increase.
Yeah, you don't have just a straight up rest. You always have some, what makes the graph go up here? The influx of sodium, the positively charged stuff. Well, here, your doors are completely shut. You ain't letting no sodium in, so there's no change in potential. But cardiac cells do. They have some slow sodium channels that allow sodium to slowly trickle in so that you never really get to rest. That's like y'all's Wednesday, right? You may have a few minutes, but you never really get to sit down and rest. You're here. You constantly have something going on to push you toward potential. So these cardiac cells have slow sodium channels that keep them constantly drifting toward potential. And then when they drift far enough, that sets off the action potential. Does that make sense? So that's what makes them self-excitable. They also have calcium channels that are rapid influx to help. So they're, unlike skeletal muscle, cardiac conducting cells are not solely dependent on sodium. Calcium plays a big role too. All right. Oh my God, look at this. This looks like a mess. Let's figure it out. All right. So what are we looking at here? I've seen the term refractory before. In fact, my NP1 students always mix up latency with refractory. What did we say the latent period was? It's the split second of time between the action potential and the actual contraction. So then what is refractory period? Right, so it's a period of time after an action potential where you can't generate another one. So what would prevent us from generating another action potential if we were somewhere here? Yeah, well, like, what about this situation makes it where we can't generate another action potential?
You don't.
What has to happen before we can have another one?
Your resting period?
Everything has to be reset. Everything has to go back to where it was. So with a skeletal muscle, I mean, this purple and green here, this is your refractory period. Do you see that? Do you see how short that is? Skeletal muscle, you can zap and zap and zap and zap and zap until it becomes tetany, right? It's a solid, continuous contraction. Look at the refractory period up here. Holy cow. Look how big it is. So what does that tell you about the timing of action potentials in the cardiac cell? It's slower. You can't generate them nearly as fast as you can in skeletal muscle. Why is that a good thing in your cardiac? Good, Ashley. Yeah, because you gotta have time start running, your heart goes faster, right, to keep up with the increased demand. Is there a time when it goes so fast that it no longer contracts efficiently? There is. You get it going, that's why there's a target heart rate on your cardiac equipment. Have you seen it? Hopefully you're using it properly. Usually it's around what, like 120 or something like that? You reach, depending upon your age and health or whatever, you get the heart rate accelerated too much, you don't give the ventricles time to fill up again. So even though you're squeezing and squeezing, there's nothing for you to squeeze out. So circulation is impaired, no matter how fast it's going. You see what I mean? So the refractory period being longer is important because it gives those chambers time to fill up before the coordinated contraction occurs. And the reason that it happens that way is because you have slow calcium channels that allow calcium to continue coming in so that we can plateau, and then those channels close and we get our repolarization. So if we didn't have these calcium channels, we would just go ahead and shut the sodium doors and depolarize or repolarize like we do with the skeletal muscle. Do you see the difference? Yeah? Okay. And I think that's really, yeah, this just shows you the relationship between tension and what the contraction time is. And it's the same kind of thing. Skeletal muscle, you get like a twitch and then it's over, unless you continue to zap it. Cardiac muscle, you're sustaining the contraction longer because you're leaving the positive charges open longer. Make sense? Okay. Good deal. So this is easy. Our rate of firing in a healthy person, the SA node is going to fire at about 70 to 75 beats per minute. The SA node, or I'm sorry, the AV node is about 40 to 60. So if the SA node fails, the AV node will set the pace. What happens to that person's heart rate if the SA node fails? It's going to slow down, and you can function with a heart rate that low. You might feel a little funky, but you can at least survive. In absence of both of those, then the AV bundle takes over, and it's firing at about 30 to 40. For Kenji, only 15 to 20. Most of the time, if you're less than 50, you're in trouble. So that's kind of your benchmark there. So you can survive with the AV node, but a better idea is to put in a pacemaker, which will artificially send the electrical impulse to the heart. That's not so bad. All right. We already talked about what the EKG actually measures. Do you have questions about what each part of this represents? Okay, I want you to draw one, and I want you to explain to the person sitting next to you what those values or what those peaks correspond to. Actually, if you're on the front row, you're on the front 2 rows, I want you to explain it to somebody on the back 2 rows. I want you to get an example of a test question. Atrial depolarization corresponds to which piece of this? The P wave. So you've got your electrical impulse. It's the same as the skeletal muscle zap, y'all. You've got the electrical impulse in the atria happening up here. As the doors shut and it starts to reset, what happens to the atrial muscle? It contracts. Good. And then you got a whole bunch of ions moving around. So for a brief period, you drop down below threshold, you hyperpolarize, and then what is happening at the peak of the QRS wave? Ventricular depolarization. Why is the QRS wave bigger than the P wave? Why?
Because it has to travel all the way down here, because you fibers.
Yeah, it's got to travel all the way down the bundle of his, and then back up the sides. It's a much stronger signal. It's a much heavier contraction, right? So at the top of the QRS wave, the ventricles are getting ready to fire, and then what's happening on the way down? Yeah, but what's happening to the contractile cells? Yeah, so now you have your ventricular contraction somewhere down here. Meanwhile, your conducting cells are resetting, they're getting ready to fire again, but your contractile cells are now doing an action. And then that's all it is. You've got the atria firing, the ventricles firing. And then over here is what happens during the reset period. You've got a lot of ions moving around and shifting around, and that's what causes that little jump in the T-wave. That's all it is, yes.
So what's the difference between E-wave and T-wave? Because it looks like.
It's happening in two different places. The T-wave, and for different reasons. The T-wave is for, yeah, it's ventricular, but it's ventricular reset.
So, wait, okay, so,
Hang on. So, this whole section over here is, I wish the cursor was here. So, starting at Q, this is all ventricular. Okay, so you've got your ventricular contraction, your big action potential, but it takes a bit to get everything reset. Remember, you've got calcium channels that are slow, you've got your fast sodiums that are now closed, and you're trying to pump sodium out to reset it. Meanwhile, you still have calcium and potassium trying to get balanced. So during that time, there's a brief period where you depolarize a little bit, and that's what gives you this T wave. And that's why an elevated ST segment, so from here to here, if you don't make it all the way down the hill, you don't allow for the reset. You have too many ions coming in, and you can't reset the action potential. So think of it like that, because those Purkinje fibers are little and numerous. So it takes a hot minute to get everything back to where it's supposed to go.
so it's basically repolarizing starting at R down all the way to the end of the T-wave.
Pretty much, but it's you're repolarizing on the way down, you're fairly stable here, and then you briefly depolarize again. And of course, you know, not every EKG looks like this. They're not all uniform. They're not all gonna be cookie cutter textbook. The idea is that you understand what's happening from a chemical perspective to cause those spikes on the graph. So your T wave, think of it as a result of lots of ion influx and everything trying to reset at once. Does that make sense to you? Okay. All right, so what does an EKG tell you as a diagnostic tool? Yeah, it tells you something about the rhythm. And abnormalities in EKG can indicate another type of a problem because the contraction follows the electricity. If you don't have the electricity going the right way, your contraction's not gonna go the right way either. And I like these color-coded pictures because they really give you a feel for what's going on. So here's your QRS. You're depolarizing down the bundle of his, and then your depolarization reaches the Purkinje fibers on the edges, along about here, and then by that time, everything's fired, and it's time to try and reset, and that's what you have going on with the T-wave. Repolarization, reset. Because there's a lot of conducting cells in those areas. So while one is just fired, it's resetting while the others are doing their thing. All right?
The straight lines are just resting.
Okay, so typically a normal sinus rhythm looks like a fairly normal one. What's going on here?
Some are reaching
Yeah, tell me what all the rest of y'all, what do you see here?
It looks
What
like
wave is this?
P.
It looks like a P wave to me. And then this one, this is also a P wave, isn't it? Okay, so we've got a normal rhythm here, but now what do we got right here?
Three.
Yeah, you've got another little peak that you wouldn't necessarily need. So this is a second degree block, meaning you're getting a premature contraction. Have you ever had that happen to you? Maybe if you have too much caffeine, not enough sleep, not enough food, it feels like a flutter or a little bit of arrhythmia.
Is that when you're like shaky?
It's not really shaky all over. It feels like a flutter.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm fond of telling people, you know that feeling you get when you see somebody you really like and your heart skips a beat? That's arrhythmia. When you have time, go to this YouTube video. Some medical students did this, It's fabulous and it's hysterical. Basically, they have set their rhythms to music, and they are acting out the firing of the atria and the ventricles to show what all these kind of rhythm issues are. So again, an MI is not always visible on an EKG. It can show up, but it's not always. I'm never gonna ask you to read an EKG. I mean, you need to know what the waves correspond to. You need to understand that it's electrical activity. But as far as me throwing something like this at you and asking you to tell me what it is, no, that's a subject for another day. What does it mean to be tachycardic?
Your heart rate's up.
Yeah, your heart rate's up. You can tell by looking at this how fast this is going. Yeah, compared to this one up here. What's going on here? Yeah, are the atria contracting in a coordinated way down here? No way. But it's not as serious as this nonsense.
Okay.
Yeah. Is there electrical activity here?
Yeah.
Definitely there is. But once the heart's doing this, and there's tons of movement, but it's not doing this. Yeah, so that's why
Is that legal?
it can be. If you don't fix it, that's when you get the anti-death machine. Right? Alright. Very good. And again, it's not an anti-death machine. A heart block is defined as an interruption in the conduction pathway. So if, for example, if the SA node fails, that's considered a block. So the degree depends upon which nodes it is. So if you're talking about a first degree, it is SA and AB, the very first one. Okay?
Why does she look so casual?
That's all right.
Okay.
Neither one of them look particularly distressed.
Oh, yeah, she's got a smile.
I like how they play there. The person helping with defibrillation. It's kind of obvious. I never noticed that before. That's kind of funny. Yeah, he's very, very nonchalant. Yeah, that's it.
He said, well, if I don't do it, maybe I can.
That's right. Well, we'll see about helping you. All right. So this is important. I can tell you, you gotta be able to look at this figure and understand it. All right. And it's actually not that hard. And what I always tell students is, if you can take this as a blank and you can explain every piece of it, you know the ins and outs of heart function. Because it actually makes sense. So this is where I'm gonna get into my learning methods thing. Don't memorize this. Don't. Because if you do, you're gonna memorize words and positions on the page. It is not gonna mean anything to you. You're not gonna be able to answer any test questions. Learn it through logic and let it make sense if you truly understand it inside and out. So what we're doing here is we are looking at the entire cardiac cycle, starting with contraction of the atria, ending with ventricular relaxation, and we're going to relate all of the heart events to each other. The electrical, the contractions, where is the blood, where is the pressure, where are the sounds? All right, so that's what this picture shows you, and that's how to read it. If you print it out, sometimes you can't see these lines here, but that's important because phase 1, this whole block here corresponds to this whole side of the graph. You see what I'm talking about? And then here, this one corresponds to 2A, which is this area here. This one goes with 2B, which is here. This one to 3, etc. See how it's offset? Because it won't make sense if you try to read it straight up and down. So let's take a look at our initial setup. So what's going on here at our first step? Y'all, it says it right there. The ventricles are filling up, all right? So we've got blood coming into the heart from both sides, right? How about the AV valves, open or closed? They're open. They have to be open because the blood flows just right through. Those valves just hang there, okay? So once our ventricles get filled, this is diastole. Those are 2 words you need to know. Systole, diastole. means resting. Systole is contracted. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Because this heart is clearly not doing anything, it's sitting there being filled. Hooray. So what has to happen next before we have any kind of contraction? Nope. You gotta have an electrical signal. You've got to have the electrical signal first, or there ain't no contraction. Where do we see our atrial depolarization? Up here at our P wave. You see it? There's our atrial depolarization, and then after that happens, what do we have? Atrial contraction. You see what I'm doing? So the atria contract, even though the ventricles are nearly full, they contract to make sure that all of that blood goes down there where it's supposed to. You want maximum filling in the ventricles. All right? Cool, so we have atrial contraction. Have we had any heart sounds yet? No, we have not. Those valves are they're open. The semilunar valves are closed. All right, so notice our end diastolic volume. This infers ventricles. So this is how much blood we have in the ventricles at their maximum capacity. The atria have already contracted, the ventricles are full. This is our end volume. This is all we're gonna get in there at this point. Make sense?
So that's
Okay.
2A or 2B.
That is, it's corresponds to right here. It's after atrial contraction. So this is your end diastolic volume, it's 2A. Your maximum amount. How about pressure? Have we had any pressure change in the ventricles? Not really. We had a little bit of a spike when the atria contracted. Do you see why atrial systole makes the atrial pressure go up? Because anytime you have a volume and you compress that volume, pressure goes up. Kind of like a balloon. You've got a balloon that's blown up and you put too much pressure on it, it's gonna pop. Because you're compressing something that's already pressurized. So you have a brief change in pressure as the atria contract, and then what has to happen? Not yet. We don't have contraction yet, because before we can have contraction, we have to have a signal. And in this case, what's our next electrical signal? Well, our atria have already contracted, so who's next? The ventricles, and what corresponds to ventricular signaling? No, up here. Up here. On the EKG, what corresponds? The QRS wave. So we have our QRS wave, and then a split second later we have ventricular contraction. And for a brief period of time, all of the valves are closed. You see that? That's the first thump, because now you have closed the AV valve. But you haven't generated enough pressure to get ejected through the semilunar valves. And that is referred to as isovolumetric contraction. Iso means same, volumetric, same volume. In other words, no blood is leaving or coming in, but the ventricles are contracting. It's a split second where all the valves are closed. Yeah.
So is it when the ventricles contract, that's what makes the bump, because that makes it blow up and that's the shut stop?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And that sound corresponds right here, right after ventricular contraction. So as the ventricles contract, what happens to the pressure in the lungs? It goes up because you're compressing everything. So here's your ventricular pressure. And then what's going to happen to your volume of blood as the ventricles contract? Well, hopefully it's gonna go down because you're sending it out, right? Say yes.
Yes.
Okay, all right, so for a brief second, all of the valves are closed. This is isovolumetric contraction. And then if your heart is good and strong and it can overcome the pressure in the pulmonary arteries and in the aorta, what happens? Which valves open? The semilunar valves open, right, to let the blood out. Yeah, semilunar valves open. Is there a sound when those valves open? No. Where does the sound come? when the blood tries to backflow and they close. Alright? So that's how to read this. There's your ventricular ejection, and then you have relaxation again. Notice your second heart sound is heard right after the ventricles eject, which makes sense because it's the backflow that wants to close, that causes the semilinear valves to close. Got it? See, this is not that hard. You just have to think through it and remember, without conduction, there is no contraction, and reason your way through which valves are open when. So, while you have that backflow and the closing of the semilunar valves, you have, again, a brief period where all the valves are closed, and that is isovolumetric relaxation. The ventricles have ejected everything, and while they try to relax, the valves all shut for a brief second. Make sense? Okay, so from there, now look at our end systolic volume. It's nice and low, isn't it? Hopefully, we've squeezed out as much of that blood as we can. You want this to be a low value. Okay, all right, so we've got that, and then it starts all over again. That's it. So you've got your ventricular pressure as the ventricles contract. Why do you have a slight spike? And Alex, you can't answer this because I already talked to you about it. Why do you have a slight spike in atrial pressure right here?
Slight depolarization?
It's not a depolarization in this case, it's purely mechanical.
Oh.
It's not going through it, but when the ventricles squeeze, it necessarily puts pressure up above because all the valves are closed. Do what?
Like it lifts it up?
Yeah, because it is flexible. Yeah, because the valves are all closed, but you're still squeezing, and so you're gonna get a brief little pressure spike there. How about this one? Look at the pressure in the aorta. Why does the pressure in the aorta go up as the ventricular pressure goes up? Yeah, that's where the blood's going. And the the aorta is super stretchy, super elastic. So as it stretches, the pressure goes down, right? You've opened it up, so now you've dropped the pressure. What's happening at the dicrotic notch? Well, think about it. If it's elastic and it stretches open, what's it gonna do? Ooh, it's gonna snap shut. And that's what causes that spike. And it's good because it gives the blood an extra push before it has to go all the way to the tips of your toes, right? You see how to handle this? And if you do it in order and you reason your way through it, you'll be at a level of understanding where you can go back and answer questions. Okay, when do I hear the second heart sound? Well, it's gotta be as those valves close. So what else is going on? Well, if you've got the backflow, you're in isovolumetric relaxation because for that brief time, all the valves are closed, but nothing's going in. Question?
What is the dicrotic notch again?
It's when the aorta snaps back. So the pressure in the aorta goes up as the ventricles fill it full of blood. As it stretches, the pressure drops, and as it snaps back, you get that spike up again. So then, what is this a measure of? The volume you started with versus the volume you end with? Good, stroke volume. How, the total amount that you're sending out with each squeeze. That's all that is. The end diastolic minus the end systolic. The difference in how much you filled versus how much you pumped out. I have a blank one of these on Blackboard. Use it, because honestly, if you can, this picture, if you can discuss what's going on here, then you understand. All right. I think we've covered all this. We just didn't change the slide. This is another way of showing the same thing, but I don't like this one as well. I like the one that shows the actual heart with the blood in the chambers and what have you. Okay, so we mentioned valve disorders already. Do we need to say anything more about these? I mean, it's kind of, you can include these with heart problems if you want to. I would give them maybe a 2-word definition. So you should know that like a prolapse is when part of the valve balloons in the other direction and doesn't close like it's supposed to. Stenosis is narrowing or hardening. So so that it doesn't work like it's supposed to. Sclerosis is stiffening as well. And you understand what happens if the valves are faulty. What happens to the heart? It doesn't work right, it's not efficient anymore because you're getting blood backflow. We okay with this? Yeah? Good deal. Alright, so let's get into some regulation. We already said that we have autorhythmic cells, so they kind of set their own pace, but they are influenced by other controls as well. Things like neural, endocrine, what have you. So, for example, if we're looking at a change in blood pressure, so if we have an excess blood pressure, what kind of receptors detect that? Baro. Baro always means pressure. Where do you think baroreceptors are located? In the aorta, that's one. Good. Where else? Kidneys have baroreceptors. Good. Where else? The carotids. The carotids. You want to measure pressure at its highest as it leaves the ventricles. You want to monitor pressure in the kidneys and in the brain. So that's where those are. And when that happens, you have a couple things going on from a nervous standpoint. You've got an acceleratory and an inhibitory center. They're all associated with the pons. Remember this? Pons, medulla oblongata, and all that business. So they respond by telling the heart to do what if pressure's high? Slow down. Slow down. You don't need to be going so fast. Slow down. And then same thing with the vascular system. It's gonna cause, the nerve response is gonna cause vasodilation. What does it mean to dilate? To open up. Why does opening up reduce pressure? Yeah, it has to do with friction, but you're basically providing more space. So if you have a drop in pressure, from a nervous standpoint, it's the opposite. You have a vasoconstriction, you have the acceleratory centers activated, and the inhibitory ones deactivated. That's pretty simple, right? We good? Alright, so let's look at what can affect these values. A couple of terms to define. Cardiac output. Cardiac output. How much blood does each ventricle pump in 1 minute? I mean, that's pretty easy. So then, what is stroke volume and how does it differ? Yeah, the stroke volume is just an amount. How much blood is coming out? What's missing? What's the difference between that and output? Say it again. Yeah, output is a function of time. Output is a function of time. Volume, stroke volume is just how much are you sending out. So then heart rate is time. How much is it beating per minute? Yeah.
The stroke volume, is that how much blood in a minute?
No, it's just in general. So based on rate being just how much per minute, volume being just a volume, how would you calculate cardiac output? Yeah, it's rate times volume. It's right there. Rate times volume. So looking at this little equation, because that's what it is, it's a little equation. What can you tell me about how cardiac output varies with rate and volume? Now think about that for a second. Don't yell it out. Look at when I ask you a question like that, and I ask questions like this a lot. How do they vary? How do they relate to each other? How do they influence each other? Because that's what this course is. What you ask yourself is, okay, looking at this as if it were numbers in a math problem. What happens to your cardiac output if your heart rate is increased? If heart rate increases, what does that do to output?
It increases it?
It's also going to increase, necessarily. So that is direct variation. They vary directly. If one goes up, the other one goes up. How about stroke volume? How does it affect rate? Or I'm sorry, how does it affect output? It's the same thing, because you're multiplying them. If the stroke volume increases, the output is going to increase. indirect variation? Direct, very good. So let's look at factors that affect each one, we'll see. Factors affecting rate, the nervous system, that autonomic, cardiac centers in the brain that we just mentioned. Hormones, they definitely affect heart rate, so do fitness levels and age. Who's got a higher resting heart rate, an athlete or a non-athlete? The non-athlete has a higher resting heart rate. We'll talk more about that in a second. And then, of course, stroke volume, it's similar, but there are other things here that we don't know of yet. Things like preload, afterload contractility, and we're getting to that. All right? Do you understand volume and rate and output as a function of both of those? Yeah? Okay. All right. Sometimes you hear a measure called the ejection fraction, and that has to do with how much blood is ejected with each stroke or each squeeze. It's normally expressed as a percentage. It's a function of stroke volume and the end diastolic volume. And the reason I mention it is because in a clinical setting, you're not really gonna be dealing with much output versus all that stuff. You're gonna be dealing with ejection fraction as your main measure of how efficient that heart is pumping. And I believe you want it to be around 70%. 70% is considered good. Once it drops below 55 or so, you've got trouble. So ejection fraction. All right. Are we good thus far? All right, yeah.
I did have one question,
Uh-huh.
it's like two slides, we have
Yeah.
one, yeah, you said these are for each measurement separately, is that just?
These mean values.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, these mean values are free, but they're still comparable because each one is pumping out roughly the same amount. Yes,
Will there be any problems where we have to do this math on the
Yes.
test?
yes.
Could you give us like a sample?
If your stroke volume is 50 mils and your heart rate is 60, what's your cardiac output?
And then we just multiply them?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, but you have to know how these things relate to each other. Because what if I gave you output and rate and asked you for volume? Then you would just divide. Very good, very good. Heart rate disorders, these are kind of interesting. These are gonna be familiar to you. Bradycardia, low heart rate. Usually it's not a problem unless you have symptoms. And speaking of symptoms, what symptoms would you expect with an abnormally slow heart rate? Fatigue, what else? Yeah, you have low blood pressure if you had low output. You probably would be cold, yeah, you might even be pale. Your exercise tolerance would be 0, yeah, what else?
It might be a question, but if you have a low heart rate normally, does that affect you if you got cut versus somebody with a higher heart rate?
Not really, not really. So then here's our question about the athletes. Why do athletes have low heart rates?
I think that